In 1982, Anatoly Karpov was at the peak of his career, and in the London tournament in '82, he won two very interesting games against the Dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, and he won them both in the G4 variation, and this is one of those two games. In this position, the most common move is bishop to c4. The idea of that move is to prevent d5 and also to prevent the black bishop from coming out to an active diagonal on e6, and also just to prepare the bishop for the attack against the black king. But in this game, Karpov plays a different line, which also aims to prevent d5, but the bishop on f1 stays there for now. The idea of g4 is of course to prepare the advance of the pawns on the king side, but also if black now tries to play d5, then white has a good response in pawn to g5, forcing the black knight on f6 to move away, and then the d5 pawn would fall. But of course this gives black a chance to prevent bishop c4. Black is not afraid to expose his bishop to the capture from the white knight, because if white takes on e6 now, then black would recapture with the f pawn, and he would have the rook becoming active on the f file against the weakened pawn on f3, and also with the pawn on e6, black would cover up the d5 square, which is one of the main sort of outposts for white against the dragon. Another option was pawn to b5, attempting to advance the pawns on the queen side as soon as possible. White had the option of continuing with pawn to h5 instead of this, and then the game would get pretty sharp and very complicated. But Karpov goes for the so-called endgame variation, where white has a bit of a long-term advantage. It's a very small advantage, but the position remains more balanced, and it's easier to control the situation, and overall this endgame line matches Karpov's style quite well. The main line here is knight takes on d5. But the capture with the bishop is also frequently played. In a different game played in the same year, Tony Miles was actually playing with the white pieces, and he played a move different from Karpov's move. He played, if Karpov played bishop e2, Tony Miles played bishop to h3, and the idea of that move is to play g5 and to cut off the c8 square from the black rooks, so that black wouldn't be able to double on the c file, and that's also an interesting idea. But this game went a bit differently. In this endgame, white has two bishops, but this is not terribly important, because after the knight moves away from f6, white will probably have to trade off that bishop on d4 for the bishop on g7. What's more important is that white has a bit of a spatial advantage here, because the pawn on d5 is quite advanced, and because he also advanced the king side pawns. So this will be the main factor in the position. Will the white pawns that have advanced far, will they be the strength, and will white be able to gain some advantage by maneuvering the pieces behind those pawns, or is that pawn on d5 is just going to become a weakness and a target for the black knight? So it really depends on the skill of the players as to who gets the advantage in this position. But of course, because Karpov was a great endgame player, this position was suiting him quite well. This move is a bit passive. It was probably better to take on d4 and then just try to break through with pawn to e5, so that if white takes on e6, then black would take with the knight and try to counterattack the white pawns, and that was probably the best way to go. After the passive move, rook to c7, black's position becomes slightly worse. So because the pawn on d5 is constraining the black pawns, white's able to build up some pressure against the e7 pawn. I guess if black was able to play pawn to b4, then he would have a pretty nice position. But the problem with playing pawn to a5 is that black really never gets to play pawn to b4, and by advancing the a pawn, he actually weakens the b5 pawn, and Karpov is very quick to exploit that. Now if black exchanges on b4, then white's going to simply take with the rook, and the b5 pawn is going to be very difficult to defend. It may seem that white's pawn structure is ruined, but temporarily he has an extra pawn, and his pieces are still pretty active. So Karpov manages to tactically find the ways to exploit the active placement of his pieces to his advantage. So the pawn that was supposed to be really weak and was supposed to be a good target, now it suddenly advances, and it's going to take time for black to recapture it, and then he may not have that time because his pieces are generally tied up on the c-file. This position may have seemed pretty nice to Miles because he got back the pawn, he's attacking the rook, and the white pawns are pretty weak, but there's something that he didn't anticipate. This exchange sacrifice is pretty natural, and Tony Miles probably did see the sacrifice, but it is really the next move that is the point of Karpov's combination. If white now goes bishop to g2, then black can play rook to d4 followed by pawn to d5, and he will be able to close off that diagonal. So white has to do something else. Now if black exchanges on c3, then he doesn't have time to play rook d4 and d5, and if then he plays rook to c5, then white goes king to b4, and the white king is actually able to support the a pawn. So black has to retreat with the rook from the c-file, but that also means that the white rook is able to invade and support the passed pawn. On d1, the rook is really cut off from the defense against the passed pawn, so white has the king, the rook, and the bishop to pretty much support the passed pawn, so he wins quite easily from here. So black is able to promote his pawn, but he ends up being down the rook once the queens appear on the board. With his next move, white is going to get the queen on the board, and he's just going to be up a rook, so black resigned. This is a very interesting game by Karpov, where he just kind of outplays Tony Miles in this endgame, and there's a very nice combination that kind of allows Karpov to wrap up the game.